Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Gun violence is a public health issue. I have seen this issue up close in my community. I have seen the physical wounds, and I have been to the funerals of teenagers, and I have embraced their middle school teachers. I have held the hands of mothers and who have lost their children, and we wept together. I have seen the trauma and the mayhem that gun violence leaves behind. The Ford government announced a suite of measures to tackle gun violence, but I must say it is not enough. Gun violence is a public health crisis, a crisis that leaves trauma and a rippling effect through families and communities, and the intergenerational pain is real. It is time we recognize that gun violence is a public health issue. Nationwide, we have seen that criminal use of firearms is increasing. Between 2009 and 2019, there was an 81% increase. This year, in the midst of COVID, Toronto endured one of its worst Octobers on record, with 11 homicides, 8 of which were firearms related. This is not a one-off. Recall last June when a brazen public shooting took place at a child's birthday party, and the victims were children. And again, I know that this is devastating, but it is not an isolated incident, nor is it just an issue for big cities. On November the 19th, the people of Barrie endured their first shooting in 2 years, and it was fatal. In the same week, in Hamilton, a man was gunned down. And just the week before, in the town of Ajax, the citizens lost one of their own to violence. In my community of Scarborough-Guildwood, there have been 8 shootings in the month of November alone. 8 shootings. This is happening all across Ontario, and it is time that we address gun violence and that we have new solutions. Today, I am calling on the Minister of Health to incorporate a public health approach and trauma-informed focus to gun violence into her government legislation, as well as tackling this problem from the root cause. Doug Ford and his government must directly address the physical and psychological impacts of gun violence that ripple through Ontario. Premier Ford has committed to combating this with a different approach, using guns and gangs. But that alone will not cut it. That does not help the grieving mothers, the families, and the communities who are experiencing trauma. It does not mitigate the long-term impacts it leaves communities. We need to do better, and we can do so by working together. Later today, I will be introducing my private member's bill, the Safe and Healthy Communities Act, which declares gun violence a public health issue, and it requires the provincial government to develop community and hospital-based violence intervention programs. In the absence of hospital-based violence intervention programs, hospitals typically treat and release those same patients who are victims of violence, sending them back into the very same communities and the environments in which they were injured. These individuals are often without a strategy for how to stay safe, the ability to manage community pressure to seek revenge, or the means to positively alter the course of their life trajectory. And police intervention, awareness campaigns, and border controls simply are not enough either. My bill will allow boards of health to develop programs and services to reduce gun violence and make way to increase community capacity to assist survivors and others impacted. This means that trauma-informed counseling for survivors and their connections affected by gun violence will be covered by OHIP. This legislation will acknowledge the shattering impacts of gun violence that it has on communities and give people affected by gun violence the resources that they need to heal, which is long overdue. As leaders, we have an opportunity to intervene in a proactive manner that would solve this problem at its root and focus on prevention. I urge Premier Ford and Minister Elliott to review this proposed legislation and to incorporate these policies into the work that they are doing now. In November of 2019, the Toronto City Council received and approved a report from the Toronto Public Health Board, which called on the government to adopt my private member's bill, the Safe and Healthy Communities Act. I urge the Premier and the Minister of Health to really speak to the long list of public health stakeholders who are calling for this type of an approach here in Ontario. I urge the Premier and Minister of Health to put aside partisanship issues and to create an environment where we can have the best possible solution with a comprehensive approach that is holistic to stopping gun violence before it occurs in our communities. I would now like to introduce Dr. Onye Noram. Dr. Noram is a family doctor and a public health and preventative medicine specialist. She is the Associate Program Director of Public Health and Preventative Medicine Residency Program at the University of Toronto, and is the Black Health Theme Lead for the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. She is the President of the Black Physicians Association of Ontario, and I know I have seen Dr. Noram on the very front lines of our COVID response. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with me this morning. Dr. Noram?
Good morning. Thank you, MPP Mitzie Hunter. I really am hoping that this bill is adopted. Yes, today I'm a doctor and a practicing public health physician, but I still remember as a young person what it was like to run and duck from the sounds of gunshots. As a young person, I know what it is like to go to so many funerals that you stop going to funerals. And I also know what it's like to move to a neighborhood where that is no longer an issue, but still flinch when you hear certain sounds. I strongly believe that this bill will make a difference in the interventions that it involves. But on top of that, as a public health physician, I know that this is a public health issue, and it requires a public health response. I'm not alone in that position. Public health physicians and public health practitioners across North America have spoken out about this issue as well. And in particular, here in Ontario, Toronto Public Health, in their report, recommended the adoption of this bill. And so I'm very hopeful that the government of Ontario will adopt this bill, because I think it will be so important for communities and over the long run have an impact on saving lives. And so I think this is a critical step in the right direction.